Welcome to the part 2 of this tutorial series that will teach you the basics of VR development. In last episode, we learned how to set up a project from scratch that works for any VR headset. And in this video, we learn how to manage the player's input and use it to show the controllers and hand movement. I'm Valem and this channel is all about VR development, so if you don't want to miss the next video, make sure to subscribe and ring this notification bell. Also, if you want to support this channel and get access to exclusive content like this extra episode on how to make a zombie shooter game, come check out my Patreon, the link is in the description below. But without further ado, let's jump right in the tutorial. So as you know from the previous episode, our VR setup works for all kinds of VR headsets. But when we look at their controller, they are all different. So how can we make an input system that will work for all of them? And the answer is this. This is how Unity merged all VR controller in one place. As you can see, it associates a unique button for each. And that's legitimate because even if the controllers are different, they all share similar elements like a trigger button, a grip button or touchpad. But now let's see how we can use it in our own VR game. Okay, so we are back in Unity, where we were at the end of last episode. The first thing that I want to show you is the XR interaction debugger. So let's go to Windows, Analysis, Input Debugger. As you can see, we have a new Windows that shows now. And if we activate the input device and we click on play, you can see that my headset and controllers are showing and that we have all kinds of information for them, starting by their name, the position, the velocity, but also the button. So for example, I can press on the trigger button here and you will see this value updated. So what I recommend you to do is to play with your controller right now using this window and get familiar with the name and the different value that you can get. Because this is going to be really important for the next part of this video. By the way, if the input are not changing, it may be because of your headset not activated, so move it a bit and normally it should work right away. Now let's see how we can use this input in a custom component. I will start by creating a new empty game object called hand presence. You will see why in a minute. We can reset its position to 0, 0, 0. Now I will create a custom component by clicking on add component, call it in my case also hand presence, and now we can click on new script, create and add. You should automatically have an empty code page popping up, but if you don't, just double click on the script name. And here we go, so this is what we will use to create custom component using C#. So I know that some of you might have never coded before, but that's perfectly fine. As this is a VR tutorial, I won't have the time to explain every detail about programming, but what I can give you is an idea of how things work. So bear with me and let's get started. Now, as you see, we have already two functions in the script, start and update. This will be automatically called at the start of the game for the start function and every frame of the game for the update function. Now, to access our controller, I will start by adding unityengine.xr at the top of the script here. To get the devices, we can simply create a new list of devices with list input devices, devices equals new list of input devices, and then populate this list with all our devices by calling input devices, this time with a s, dot get devices, and by giving it our list. And there we go, now this device list will contain everything we use, so the headset and the controllers for my case. We can maybe browse our list by using a for each loop, so let's write for each, double press the tab key so that the rest will be written for us. Instead of collection, it's our devices list that we want to browse. And there we go, we can now access each device parameter with item. By accessing the device element, you can see that we can have a bunch of useful data like the name, the manufacturer, the characteristic. To test this, we can show these elements in the console windows with debug.log item.name plus item.characteristics. This will create a text that will show first the name and then the characteristic. Now let's save our script, go back to Unity and click on play to test what we've made. And there you go, now if we open the console by going to Windows, General, Console, you can see that we have all of our devices showing, so the head, the left controller and the right controller. Having this information can be really useful if we want, for example, to show the appropriate controller to the player by associating a name to the corresponding 3D model of the controller. And this is what I will show you in the next part of this tutorial. But before, let's have a look at managing the input from these devices. So we have a list of devices, but what if we wanted to access only the right controller, for example? And this is what we will do now. Instead of calling getDevices, let's use getDevices with characteristics. As you can see, this function needs an extra parameter of type inputDeviceCharacteristic. To make it, let's create a new inputDeviceCharacteristic variable that I will call rightControllerCharacteristics, and then we can set it to any characteristic that you can see here. In my case, I will select right. We can even add some additional characteristic with the vertical bar. So let's maybe add inputDeviceCharacteristic.controller for our case. And here we go. Now we get a list of all devices that have these characteristics. We can test it right away by saving our script and clicking on play. And there you go, you can see that now only the right controller appears in the console windows. So at this point, we still have a list of devices, and in certain cases, your player might have a weird setup where you use several controllers. In this case, it's your choice on what device you want to listen, or if you want to listen to all. In my case, I will keep things really simple and listen to the first one that shows on the list. So I will create a private input device variable called target device and set it to the first element of the list with device bracket 0. And maybe in case that our player has no left controller at all, it's better to check if the number of devices in the list is greater than 0 to be sure that we have at least something. Perfect, we have the controller that we want to listen in our game for the input. Let's learn how to get a particular input from the device, and you will see it's actually really simple. Now in the update function, we simply need to take the device we want to listen, so target device in our case, and call try and get features value. As you can see, this function takes two parameters. The first one is the button we want to listen, and the second is the output value, which can be of three types. Boolean, to say if the button is being pressed or not. Float, for an axis value that range between 0 and 1, like the trigger axis, for example. And vector2 for movement on two axes, like it's the case for the touchpad. I will make an example for each of them. So let's, for example, test if we're pressing the primary button. So for the first parameter, I will use common usages.primary button. And for the second, out bool primary button value. The out keyword here means that this value will be modified inside this function and that we can use it afterwards. So for example, now if we are pressing the button, so if primary button value, we can write in the console pressing primary button. Let's save our script to test this. And here you go, you can see that it writes correctly when we press it. Now for other types of input, it's exactly the same. So for example, for the trigger value, let's do device.tryandgetFeatures value, common usage.trigger, and this time as it's an axis, we will output a float called trigger value. And there you go, if trigger value is greater than a certain threshold, so let's say 0.1, we can write this value in the console with debug.log trigger pressed plus trigger value. Same goes for the touchpad, so let's write device.tryandgetFeatures value, common usage.primary 2D axis, out vector2 primary 2D axis value, and write it in the console if the vector2 is different than vector2.0 with debug.log primary touchpad plus primary 2D axis value. Now let's save our script and test what we've made. And perfect! As you can see, if I press on the button, the axis or the touchpad, we get the proper value. Awesome! And basically that's it. We've seen how to access a device and listen to any type of input using it. Important remark here, if your player uses a controller that does not have the input you want to listen, this can be problematic. But in this case, the whole try and get value will return false, so you can use it to know if the controller has the input and pursue. So in our case, I will put it in the if statement before we use it. And here you go, now everything is under control. We first test if the controller has the value and then we use it. Okay, now that we know everything to use the input, let's put it to use. And I will show you, as promised, how to show the correct controller for the player using the device data. As we need to show the controller, we need a 3D model for them. If you have already SteamVR installed on your computer, you can find a folder that contains some 3D controller models in Steam Apps, Common, SteamVR, Resources, Render Models. Other 3D models are also available for free on the headset website, for example for the Oculus or the Windows Mixed Reality headset. And to import a 3D model, it's really simple. You just have to drag it in the project windows of your project. However, to spare you some time, I made a Unity package with all the controllers I could find that you will be able to download in the description below. You can simply download it, drag it in your project folder, and you will find the list of all controllers that I have made that you can import in your project. And there you go, now let's learn how to use them using the device data. First, we need to create a list for this game object with public list game object controller prefabs. Now, if we save our script, you can see that this variable appears and that we can populate it with the controller we imported in our project. Now, to spawn the correct controller, we will use the device name. So here, after we get the device, we can search a controller among the list we have that will have the same name, and we can do it with controller prefabs.find controller as controller.name equals device.name. So here, this find function is particular. It returns the element that has the property in it. So in our case, we are searching for the property that the controller.name is equals to the device name. And be careful for this to work, it means that the device name we have for controller must match the game object 3D model that we use. Fortunately, that's what I've done for the project. And if we found something, we can spawn it and store it as a child of our hand with instantiate, prefab, transform. Also, we can create a private game object reference called spawn controller to have a reference to the spawn element if we want to access it later. By the way, in the case that the player controller is not among the list of 3D controllers model that we have, we can maybe write an error in the console windows with debug.log error did not find corresponding controller model, and in this case we can maybe give a default controller model. So let's say in our case that this will be the first one on the list. Now let's save and go back to Unity. So as we saw in previous episode, we can use a prefab for the visual of our controller. So in my case, we will use this hand present for the right hand. Let's first drag in our project windows, remove the one from the scene and drag it in the hand prefab. Now we can use this instead of the cube controller, and here we go. Now let's click on play to test our game. And there you go, you can see that the correct right Oculus Touch appears in my case as I'm using it, and this works as well with other controllers. Awesome! So this works for the right controller. Let's extend our script to work for both hands. As you can see, the controller is selected using the characteristics that we made earlier, so instead of using it, there I will make it as a variable that will show in the Unity inspector. First, let's create a new variable of type input device characteristic called controller characteristic. And instead of the one we created by hand, here we can use the variable we made. Okay, perfect. Now let's save and go back to Unity. And here you go. As you can see, if I select the prefab, you can see that I can select the characteristics myself. So in this case, for this one, I will select both right and controller. We can duplicate the prefab with Ctrl D, and this time select left and controller as characteristic. To be more explicit, I will also rename the first one to right hand presents and the second one to left hand presents. Perfect. Now last thing we need to do is drag the left hand presents prefab in the model prefab of the left XR controller instead of the old controller we made. Here we go, we are ready to test our game. And now you can see that both our controllers are showing with a system that works for any headset. How awesome is that? Okay, but what if we don't want a controller? What if we wanted a hand instead? And this is what I will show you now. So to make a hand, we obviously need a 3D model of a hand, and if possible with animations. This tutorial will work for all kinds, but in my case, I will use the custom hands from the Oculus integration that a lot of you already know from my previous tutorial series. As before, you can download the Oculus integration and drag these hands in your project, but to spare you some time, I will prepare a folder that you can download in the description below. Now let's drag it in our project and import everything. In the exact same way for the controller, I will create two variables. One is the hand model prefab, which references the hand we want in the project folder, and a spawn hand model variable, which references the one that will spawn in the game. Finally, I will also create a public bool variable called showController and set it initially to false. This is the variable that we will use to display either the controller or the hands. Now, in the same way we did for the controllers, I will instantiate the hand and put it as a child of this game object with instantiate and model transform, and set this spawn element to be the spawn hand model. Now finally, in the update function, let's remove what we did earlier, and if we want to show the controller, we can activate the controller and hide the hand. Otherwise, we can hide the controller and show the hands. And there we go. Now let's save. Don't forget to drag the hand on the hand model, so the custom left hand for the left hand controller and the custom right hand for the right hand controller. And there we go. Now if we hit play, you can see that the hands are showing. Awesome. And we can even switch it to the controller here if we click on the show controller variable. Pretty cool, right? But for now the hands are static. I will show you now how we can animate the hands according to the input of the player. We obviously need hands animation. So in my case, I have for each hands 3 animation, a default pose, a pinch pose and a grip pose. Now to manage this animation, I will need an animator. So I will right click in the project windows, create animator, call it a right hand animator and drag it as the animator for the 3D model of our right hand. Now let's edit the animator to use our hand animations. To do this, you can first select the animator we just created and go to Windows, Animation, Animator. Now all of the hands animation will be managed by 2 values that I can create by clicking on parameters and then the plus button over here. Let's select float and call this value grip. Let's create another float value called trigger. Perfect. Now to use this value to switch animation, I will create a blend tree by first right clicking in the panel here and selecting blend tree. Now we can double click on the blend tree to go inside it. There you will find that we can select a type of blend tree. In our case, as we have 2 parameters, I will select 2D freeform Cartesian. Make sure that the grip parameter is selected as the first variable here and the trigger parameter as the second one. And here we go, I will be able to put some animation that will be triggered when these parameters have the value that we will set below. So in our case, I will create 4 motion fields, one set at 0, 0, another at 0, 1, and the other 2 at 1, 0 and 1, 1. Perfect. Now what's left to do is complete them with the good animation. At 0, 0, it means that we have no grip and no trigger, so this will be the default pose animation, which we can drag from the right hand default pose animation to this animation field right there. At 0, 1, it means that we are pinching, but no grip. So I will drag the pinch animation. And in the same way at 1, 0, it means that we need to grip, so I will drag the right grip pose. And now at 1, 1, we are both gripping and pinching, so this is really a preference. I find that I prefer to use the grip animation over the pinch animation, so I will drag it over there. And there you go, we now have our movement completed. As you can see, if I move the red dot over there, our hand is animating according to the 2 values that we are using. That's really cool. Okay, so that was for the animator of the right hand. For the left hand, we will just duplicate the animator and call it left hand animator. Now we can simply drag it as we did for the right hand in the right hand model. Finally, for the left hand animator, we can replay the animation of the right hand by the same animation but for the left hand. Okay, so we can animate our hands with two values. Now what's left to do is to update this value in our script using what we learned about the input system. So let's go back to the hand present script. Okay, so as we need an animator, I will first create a new private variable called hand animator. We can access the hand animator once we spawn it here in the start function. So hand animator equals spawn hand model.getComponent of type animator. Perfect. Now to animate the hands, I will create a new function called update hand animation. To get the trigger value of the controller, we can do as we think earlier. If target device.try and get features value, common usage.trigger, out float trigger value. And in this case, we can set the trigger parameter of the animator to trigger value. Otherwise, we can set it to 0. So by doing this, I'm checking if the controller has a trigger button, and otherwise I'm setting the trigger animation to 0. Now we can do exactly the same, but this time for the grip button. So I'm going to select all of this and copy paste it below. Now we can rename trigger by grip, and here we go, we can now update the grip parameter of the animator. Finally, what's left for us to do is call this function when we want to update the hands animation. So in our case, it will be when we are not showing the controllers in the update function. Now let's save our game and click on play. And there we have it, we have now our hands showing and moving according to what button we press. That's so cool. And you can keep on building this hand present script to add new animation according to the input of the player. By the way, as you can see, I can still interact with objects like in the previous episode, and having my real hand grip makes it really easy to understand that this is the mechanism to grab an object. Okay, so we still have a bit of time before the video ends. I want to fix an issue that we can have with our system, so let's go back to our script. As you can see, we initialize our hand presence at the start of the game. This is a problem because sometimes the controller of the player are not activated at the start of the game, but only later when we pick them up. This means that we need to keep checking to initialize our hand presence if we don't have a target device yet. So to do it really simply, we can create a new function called try_initialize, move all the code from the start function inside this new function. We can now call this function at the start of the game to have what we had before, but we can now, in the update function, check if the target device is null, and if it's the case, we try to initialize again. And if it's not null, now we can update the hand presence like before. This way, our setup will always work even if there are no controllers at the start of the game. For example, in this case, you see the game is already playing and boom, if I activate my controllers now, it works properly and the setup for hand present is working. And there you have it, that is all for today guys. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial as much as I did making it. If you did, you know how it goes, please like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, it helps a lot to promote this channel, so thank you. As always, a big shout out to my new Patreon, you guys are the reason that I am still able to make this video. And if you want to join us and get access to the source code of all of my projects and exclusive content like this course on how to make this zombie shooter game, please join us. The link is in the description below. Anyway, thank you for watching till the end and see you in the next video.